This is the Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. It was an image that resonated around the world. Slickly produced footage of the American journalist James Foley with a knife to his neck being brandished apparently by a man with a London accent highlighted how the group Islamic State was a brutal as well as media-savvy organisation. They scored a propaganda goal. It was on the front pages of the newspapers around the world and made the top story on every news bulletin. Indeed, the fact that a British voice was apparently heard in the footage highlighted the extent to which this vicious battle in the Middle East had links to Britain. Indeed, according to some estimates, there are 500 Britons fighting in Iraq and Syria. There are growing concerns over what could happen if even a small proportion of this radicalised group returns home. The questions many want answered is what is actually driving their cause. Muslim groups around the world have criticised the actions of Islamic State, but that does not seem to deter them. Is there a basis in the Quran for what they do? What about the British response and the chances of the British government to reach out to the Muslim community in Britain? Well, to discuss this and the issues surrounding it, I'm pleased to be joined by Salim Shagtai. He's Head of Public Relations at the Islamic Education and Research Academy. Also here is Khalil Charles, Head of Media and Communications at the Muslim Association of Britain. And on the line, we have Dr. Omar Ashur, who is a Senior Lecturer in Middle East Politics at the University of Exeter. He's also a Fellow at the Brookings Institute. Well, many thanks for joining us. First of all, Salim, there has been no shortage of Islamic leaders condemning these barbaric acts. And this includes not just, of course, the execution of James Foley, also the massacring of Yazidis. Is there something in the Quran that is driving their actions, driving their philosophy and their ideology?
Well, I'm sure they'd like to think so, but ultimately what this comes down to is that the Islamic State seems to be a very political motivated group, and what they seem to be going after is power, and power at the expense of all other Islamic groups. And even though they're a Sunni group, they seem to be alienating and ostracizing other Sunni groups and maybe declaring takfir or declaring them to be infidels and apostates, and therefore justifying a war against them. And what the issue is here is that by their declaration of the caliphate, which has been criticized by the Council of Syrian Scholars and a number of bodies worldwide, and no Sunni authority in the entire Muslim world has actually agreed with them, then you'll find that by them declaring a caliphate, what they've inadvertently done is that anybody who disagrees with them politically and does not join them is now, and potentially that includes probably myself and Khalil Charles and Dr. Ashur on the line there, is that we are therefore renegades and rebels. And this is something which has absolutely no basis in Islam whatsoever, unfortunately.
Khalil, I mean, that declaration of a caliphate, controversial, I would have thought. I mean, does this suggest that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is as dangerous as he is delusional? Because it sounds like he's not trying to incorporate the global version of Islam across many communities.
Well, the real question is at the moment, for me, is that not necessarily just his intentions, but where does this Islamic State originate from? What is it financing it? Where were its beginnings? There are some things that we know, some things that there are speculation. What we don't know is the full truth. And yes, I consider, and others do, anybody who loves the religion of Islam, as seeing the religion being hijacked by people who are killing Muslims. And I think that's the key thing here. There are thousands and thousands of Muslims being killed at the hands of these so-called Islamic State. And that's the key thing. Yes, the world comes out and starts scrutinizing this issue when there are others like the Yazidis and being persecuted, Christians that are being persecuted. But let's not forget that persecution in that area has been going on continually, and ISIS have been fighting Syrian Free Army, they've been fighting other Muslims in order to gain power. And I agree with my colleague, it's about getting power and about getting a stake in some control of this area. So that means that he doesn't really care about what the wider Muslim community has to say, because his aim is simply to gain that power and that control.
But Salim, he wouldn't necessarily admit to wanting political power. That would be seen as something un-Islamic potentially. He wouldn't say, yes, I am seeking power. He's doing it in the name of his faith.
Well, the funny thing is that's exactly what he's done. I mean, the minute you see a very choreographed khutbah or the Friday sermon where he looked like what a caliph would, and it was incredible. I mean, I was speaking to a number of colleagues, and he looked the part. I mean, he looked like the Caliph Omar, who was the second caliph in the history of Islam. His life has been put into a multi-part documentary by the NBC, and actually, he looked exactly like that. I mean, he spoke extremely clear classical Arabic. It was Quranic Arabic. He looked the part, but it just smelt fishy to me. It just looked so slick. It looked almost like a Hollywood production. So, but that's exactly what he's done. And if you look at the statements of the Islamic State, they are basically not speaking anything of the language of the Quran. They're not speaking anything of the language of the Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace. And the language that they use isn't about establishing peace, justice and harmony, which is what Islamic governance is all about. It seems to be the exact antithesis, which is genocide, murder, and subjugation of anybody else who disagrees with them, as far as the reports go. So this is something to make clear that Islam has nothing to do with this.
I'll bring in Dr. Ashur in a minute, but Khalil, just on that point, they are using quotes from the Quran, though. The beheading of they cite the beheading of something like 600 opponents of the Prophet, and I'm just wondering. There was a report actually in the New Statesman that the 2 British recruits who pleaded guilty to terror offences last month knew so little about Islam that they bought a book, Islam for Dummies, and the Quran for Dummies. I'm just wondering, across the 10,000 or however many people are there, do the supporters understand at least some degree of Islam?
Well, that's hard to say. I mean, there's certainly people who passionately feel that this has something to do with Islam, that there is a job to be done. But I think these people are disaffected like anybody else that doesn't have an engagement in society in which they live in. And you find that people, in a sense, that can't get on in society will find a mechanism to achieve some kind of
So
end.
it's a disenchantment. It's a disenfranchisement.
I think it is. I think it's a disenchantment about... I don't want to be apologetic for that, because I don't believe that disenchantment should mean you go and kill other people. That's not a basis of or justification for that. But what I am saying is that there are people who feel it's almost like this is a gang for them. This is a gang mentality. They've transferred, if you like, I'm not maligning South London or whatever. They've transferred, if you like, South London gang mentality into Islamic Jihad mentality, not even understanding what the Quran and what the traditions of the prophets are. It's simply just a transference of that aggression, if you like, being part of a group, being felt a sense of belonging, etc. And if I can go on to say, there are confused signals that are coming because the government called Parliament back last year with the intention of going into Syria, putting boots on the ground and getting involved in some action. So that could be sending a signal and say, well, our government's prepared to go in there, can we not do that too? I don't say this is a correct way of thinking, but I'm saying there is a confusion that's going on here to which some of them are part of.
Actually, that confusion I'd like to bring up with you, Dr. Ashur. Obviously, some of the militants of ISIS, now known as the Islamic State, are fighting in Syria. They're fighting against Bashar al-Assad. They're fighting for the freedom of that country. How much of their goals are political, are military, and how much of them are religious, do you think?
It's a mix of goals, really. On one hand, you have a religious dimension that more or less serves in recruiting young men, and serves in casting some sort of a religious legitimacy. But if you look at the roots of it, what they do is really very selectively choose specific fatwas and specific episodes in Islamic jurisprudence and in Islamic history, and dismiss what was happening in the last few centuries, and then apply these specific events, fatwas, on the 21st century and on the context that they are operating in, there to get some sort of legitimacy and to get more recruitment. But the political side is very obvious as well. In the end, the idea is to create an entity that they want to call the Islamic State, and more or less fight very much a local battle in Iraq and in Syria. A local battle in Syria, where you have an uprising, an armed revolution against the regime of Bashar al-Assad, one of the most brutal regimes in the region, but more or less casting themselves as the only legitimate fighting force, the only Islamically legitimate fighting force, and therefore everybody else has to be under them. And this more or less led them to a war against Bashar's regime on one hand, but also a war against all the other armed revolutionary groups and other, including Islamist and jihadists, even groups like Jabhat al-Nusra, for example. And in Iraq, you have more or less, this is a group that was born in Iraq after the 2003 intervention, and have been fighting and morphing and changing its name since 2004 until now, 2014. So we're talking about 10 years of experience in guerrilla warfare, 10 years experience in urban terrorism tactics, fighting against mainly the U.S. forces and then other Iraqi government forces as well, whether the security or the military. And then the logistics that they were able to garner, whether from the fight in Syria or whether from the fights in central Iraq and north of Iraq. So you have, the logistical support dimension expanded quite significantly, and I think this is what's creating really the threat. This experience, the amount of ammo, the amount of weapons, the military command structure, because this is a group that recruits many from the officers of Saddam Hussein's era. You have Haji Bakr in Syria, who was killed in Syria. That was a colonel in the military intelligence of Saddam Hussein, and therefore the background in the military as well is quite significant. And Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi himself, I think he was one of the reserve officers at one point in the Iraqi army under Saddam.
And indeed, you mentioned there Saddam Hussein and the legacy of that 2003 invasion, and often the language of, say, al-Qaeda over the last few years is get Western troops off Muslim lands. What about, for, say, the layperson such as myself? How are we to view the difference between al-Qaeda and its ideology and that of the Islamic State?
I think in terms of ideology, there are quite, it's sort of interesting because the Islamic State is a fringe of a fringe, So Al-Qaeda as a fringe, it took even a more extreme twist in a sense that they're using excommunication, declaring others as infidels and apostates in a much wider way than Al-Qaeda does. It is quite similar to what the group Islamic Armée, the Jihad in Algeria in the 1990s was doing, in a sense that it even declared and threatened Osama bin Laden to slaughter him at some point in Sudan. So you have this kind of dimension, the declaring whoever is a rival as Islamically illegitimate, and at the core of it, of course, there is a leadership issue. Who gives who controls the multiple brigades of the organization, and who is at the top of the command and control structure? And I don't think they accepted the Al-Qaeda leadership to have that role. And it was very clear when the head of Al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri, has asked them to leave Syria and to return back in Iraq, and to leave Abu Muhammad al-Jilani, the head of the Nusra Front, at the top of the organization in Syria. And that was rejected, and not just rejected, but they issued some audio and video tapes criticizing heavily al-Zawahiri, and basically saying that the man has gone too old and too senile to lead the organization. So it was a mockery even of Al-Qaeda's leadership. So there is a leadership issue, and there is an expansion in declaring apostates, declaring other Muslims as apostates, and then acting on such declaration, meaning using violence against them because it's sanctioned between quotations.
Salim, a lot to tease out there, but this idea of one group of Muslims declaring another group of Muslims apostates and non-believers and heretics and whatever, that's been littered. History's littered with instances of that, isn't there? I mean, over the last 1,500 years.
Well, actually, no. You'll actually find that in Islamic history, in terms of the kind of the whole heresiology, what's more been used, actually, you'll find even in Islamic history, you'll find that there's been, for example, the Abbasid Caliphate actually fought the Umayyads, and that was just purely about power. They didn't declare them apostates. They didn't even declare them even heretics. It was literally a power struggle. Same way, and when various caliphates fell and came and gone, and various empires came and went, it was just literally another power just emerging. It actually wasn't given very much religious justification, which is quite striking. This is a very modern phenomenon. It's a very modern phenomenon because it's actually simply because after colonial rule and the destruction of the caliphate and the sense of Muslim political unity, then what you found is that you found different ideologies competing with each other, trying to then gain supremacy. So this idea of people being excommunicating them or declaring them apostates or infidels seems to be a very 20th century and now 21st century kind of phenomenon, where because if you look at the origin of this, you find this only coming about in certain jihadist groups adopting this in the 1950s and 60s, again in response to brutal suppression by secular regimes in the Arab world. And this is where you find it. And
you're effectively saying that it's really a degree of alienation that's fostering this British idea, or Britons who go out to fight jihad in this part of the world. That suggests, I guess, a lack of engagement between, say, the British government and the Muslim community.
I would have to say yes, there is in some quarters a massive lack of engagement. And what has been the way of trying to solve that has been the ideas surrounding PREVENT, which is supposed to be a strategy to try and de-radicalize people or to certainly prevent them from getting radicalized. And in a sense, this has been not very effective because it's not engaging with the people that need to be engaged with, because the young people are not, if you like, being involved in the Muslim community per se. And I have to say that there are many people now calling for imams and people in mothers and fathers to shop their children and that kind of thing. There is, unfortunately, a disconnect that some of these people have with their own families and have with their own with their own imams in areas where they don't necessarily go and pray and necessarily feel eye to eye with what's going on in their mosques.
Of course, because you have people who the parents didn't know about the extremism of their son.
Absolutely. I mean, and if they did know, I'm sure the parents would have something to say about that or do something positive to try and prevent that. But you've also got a situation where, unfortunately, when mosques, if you like, started up in the late 50s, early 60s in this country, they were generally communities of what we called heritage Muslims, in the sense that they were addressing their people who were of different ethnicity and speaking in their own language, etc. Now what we have today is the young who speak English, and in some places, and of course it's changed a lot over the years, and it's vastly improved from where it was, but there are some places where those mosques are not talking English and not getting youngsters involved in religious duties or putting forward what they need to do. And so there is, if you like, this feeling of disenchantment, this feeling of disconnect. And if someone comes along and say, oh, well, Islam's about picking a gun and being a hard man, that, for some people, sounds more appealing.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. We're discussing Islamism in the world and how it relates to Britain. With me in the studio is Salim Shagtai, Head of Public Relations at the Islamic Education and Research Academy. Also here is Khalil Charles. He's Head of Media and Communications for the Muslim Association of Britain. And on the line, Dr. Omar Ashur, a Senior Lecturer in Middle East Politics at the University of Exeter. But actually, I mean, Salim, I interviewed a spokesman from the Mosques and Imams National Advisory Board this week, and he told me that relations between the Muslim community and the British government was strained. They had their funding withdrawn. The British government didn't like the fact that it was associating with more extreme elements. I think the advisory board's position is that we need to at least have some kind of conduit some kind of conversation with them, however unpalatable you might find them. It does seem to suggest that the Muslim community doesn't really respect the kind of think tanks that the government is getting its advice off.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, the government has... the government seems to be pursuing a very neoconservative agenda. Like, for example, you have think tanks like the Henry Jackson Society, which says that we need to have a hot war abroad with Islam and a cold war with Muslims in the West. And we even see that even Khalil Charles, who's part of the Muslim Association of Britain, one of the members, Anas al-Takriti, had his family's accounts. I mean, not just him, but his children's account and his wife's account cancelled by HSBC. Now, if we've done a bit of once we look into this, we find out that this is actually politically motivated. So what's happening is that those people, the balanced, orthodox, mainstream Muslim voices, who are really the best hope of Muslims being able to engage in society, as they have been doing for many decades, and the hard work that's been built by people who were conscious of this, after the 40s and the 50s, is now being undone. Because what's happening is that the government is sending this present government is sending a very clear message, which seems to be that, you know what, unless you agree with our entire foreign policy, then you are an Islamist, you are an extremist, and we will make it very difficult for you to actually establish anything. And that war is happening through the media. That Cold War I alluded to earlier is happening via the media, or by a certain section of the Western media anyway, and by the government, giving and then taking away. And this is exactly what happened in the 1990s when the Muslim Council of Britain, which was something which was set up with the express approval of Tony Blair, as soon as that council refused to back down on the oppression of Palestinians by Israel and by Zionism, then funding was withdrawn and they were disengaged, and it seems to be happening again exactly with Minab, which you just alluded to just now. So,
but Dr. Ashur, that is a concern, isn't it? Because I guess a lot of people who aren't Muslims at all disagree fundamentally with a lot of Britain's foreign policy. If take for instance the recent attacks in Gaza by Israel, a huge proportion of the British population were abhorred by, were horrified by that situation. Do you think that the British government takes a view that, look, if you don't agree with our foreign policy, then we don't trust you?
It depends on which segment you're talking about in the British government, but there is this idea that if we should not provide legitimacy and provide some sort of credibility to organizations and groups that do not fundamentally agree with specific parties and specific factions within parties. And I think this is partly what happened in the case, as the colleagues eloquently explained earlier, that the part of the political battle is being played at the expense of Muslim organizations and Muslim communities, unfortunately.
Indeed. I mean, Halil, what do you think can be done? I mean, if the Mosques and Imams National Advisory Board they insist they haven't cut ties with the British government, but they don't have the funding. Perhaps they may get funding again in the next few years. But do you believe that the government is committed to reaching out to Muslim communities across the UK?
I think there is a sense of commitment, and there's no doubt the government will talk up the desire to be committed to continuing the relationship, a good relationship with the vast majority of the Muslims in this country. But there doesn't seem to be a lot of intelligent engagement, if I may say that. There doesn't seem to be a lot of actually talking to the communities and see what their needs are before deciding what your strategy is going to be. It tends to be the strategy imposed on what they believe will change the situation without addressing some of the issues that people are aggrieved about. And unfortunately, like it or not, the British government's stance this was verified by the way in which Baroness Warsi walked out of the government. The British stance with regard to external issues is too weak. It's not strong enough, and it puts, as she said, it puts them in a morally irreprehensible position. And I think that there needs to be a look again at the external strategy as well as the internal engagement. And I think that that's only going to come when we, as Muslims, are prepared also to engage with the problems that do exist. And let's be honest, there are problems that exist, and we have done much. MINAB have done excellent work. They produced a document about 3-4 years ago in which it surveyed almost 1,800 young people, asking them what they felt they needed to be happy with the mosque engagement, what they needed to happen. And they wrote a long list of things. And one of the things that the youth said, which I found was very, very interesting and very positive, is that they'd like to have more interfaith. They'd like to know more about other religions, and that they felt that their mosque and etc. should be providing that for them. And that's quite interesting. There was also a request for extension of sporting activities, a request for more talks, speaking English in the mosque, English lessons, etc., and engagement with education. And some understanding as to what they could do about the media. The young people were saying we need to try and tackle these media issues because we're being demonized in the media. And we have to remember that there's a growing population right now of Muslims in the British jails. Muslims who are roughly 5% of the population make up 15% of the population in jails. So we're coming to a situation where internally Muslims are getting involved in criminal activities and are being criminalized, and there isn't enough effort, if you like, at the community level, the community basis, to actually try and tackle those problems and those issues. And that's why I think that the British government, if it really was serious about doing something, could get involved by helping the organizations like MINAB, like people who are going to get to the grassroots people, and work with them and try and resolve some of these, if you like, generational problems that have now emerged. And let's not forget, young Muslims under 25 years of age are 48% in the last census of the Muslim population as a whole. So there are a vast amount of people that we're talking about that, in a sense, are not being given, if you like, an opportunity to get involved and to participate in the community, in their own community and the community at large. And I think that's very important.
I mean, do Muslims feel under siege in Britain today, Salim, over the last few months? I'm also wouldn't mind touching on the delicate matter of the situation in Rotherham, where we had over the course of 16 years, apparently local authorities afraid to tackle what was crimes committed by predominantly South Asian men for fear of being attacked as racist. Or do you think that kind of disconnect, that kind of narrative is taking place? It's difficult to tackle these issues for fear of being branded racist or anti-Islamic.
Yeah, I mean, I think in that case, I mean, there's a lot of things that, that sort of behavior, grooming girls for prostitution or trafficking or for the exploitation is something that Islam condemns in the strongest possible terms, and actually it's Islam that would actually solve the problem, because this is a moral issue. The way to stop legally and the justice and law enforcement happens after the fact. But what is going to stop people from committing those crimes in the first place? It's going to be a consciousness of God. It's going to be a fear of accountability in this life and in the hereafter. That's what should be stopping people from doing these things. And this is exactly what I mean. Islam has very strict code when it comes to sexual practice. There's no sex outside of marriage, and so therefore, I
think people would agree with that. But the disconnect, does it not highlight a disconnect between, say, the authorities and dealing with the predominantly Muslim community? They don't understand how to really deal with it. They don't have the delicacy required.
I think what it is that the authorities, and to link those 2 points together, is actually, if you don't allow if you demonize the Muslim community and declare them to be a fifth column and do not recognize them to be partners in citizenship, then what's going to happen is that the mosque and the imams who are best placed to deal with these problems, because there are many imams now who are born, brought up in this country, who understand the challenges of this country, who understand the culture, and are best placed to deal with this. If you demonize them and you declare them to be people who are fostering extremist values or such like, then what's going to happen is that, because government's not going to solve the problem, this needs to be solved in the community. This needs to be solved by the big society, after all. That's what David Cameron's been trumpeting all these years. So why not let the Muslims get on with it? If you demonize them, if you declare them to be people who are a fifth column, who are going to then, who are not to be trusted, then you're stopping the best people for the job. I mean, for example, the Islam Education Research Academy, who I represent, we give positive community projects for people to get involved in. We encourage people to do that. We say that it's time that Muslims looked after their neighbors. It's time that Muslims looked after their community and contributed. This is what we've been saying for a number of years. So again, if we're allowed to do that, if we're allowed to spread that message of peace and harmony, then this is the way to solve a number of these issues, not just the issue of grooming and sexual exploitation.
Now, we've honed in on the British element here, and just more broadly, I'd like to go back to Dr. Ashur about the international response to the Islamic State, and there's talk of perhaps the so-called coalition of the willing, perhaps a very loaded term, especially given what happened in 2003. But America wants to strike against ISIS. They want Britain's help. What do you think would happen if they did, if there was a British involvement in trying to wipe out the Islamic State? Do you think that it's a many-headed hydra, you cut off one head, another one grows? Do you think it would thwart the problem? Would it increase it? What do you think?
It depends on what is the strategy for intervention. I think if there are... The problem is very complex. It's there is ISIS, of course, and there is its threat, but the ISIS were there because of specific reasons, and some of them has to do with how the Arab Sunni population was treated in the last few years, mainly by the Maliki government in the aftermath of the U.S. withdrawal, and of course what happened after the U.S. invasion in 2003 as well. So unless these core issues are resolved, and unless you find an Iraqi elite that is willing, on one hand, to be united against the threat, and on the other hand is willing to accept an intervention to end the threat, and you have the population who are more or less revolting against the Islamic State, like what happened in 2007, and this is when you saw the threat of back then alqaeda in Iraq has been diminished. Unless you have these conditions, then I don't think an intervention would be quite successful. Maybe it will undermine it, maybe it will put it down a bit like 2007. But then the environment is, if you have this level of repression, this level of brutality, lack of freedoms, ethnic groups and religious groups who are marginalized and repressed, then you're creating the environment that either the Islamic State or other groups will emerge as violent and as extreme as we saw.
And so, Khalil, is it really incumbent on Muslim leaders around the world to continue denouncing the Islamic State? I mean,
I don't suppose they have to listen to that or anybody else at the moment, because they are in such a position of ascendancy. They are in a position where they self-financing. They are in a position where they are using very slick media techniques to recruit and to build up their power base. So, I mean, nobody on the ascendancy is going to turn around and say, "Oh, yes, you're right. Well, we should do something different." So I don't think they're in a position to really take up any of those criticism. But I have to say that we're looking for criticism for the Muslim world. But again, there are problems in the Muslim/Arab world, whereby different countries look, and the approach of being, if you like, leaders in the Arab or the Muslim world means that there are differences that means that people don't get involved on a united front. I mean, it's interesting to see we don't really have a firm statement from the Arab League. We don't really have the OIS, the Islamic countries. We don't really have any kind of positive program for them in that sense. I may be mistaken here, but this lack of unity is, if you like, what people like the Islamic State can feed off, what Baghdadi and his cronies, if I can call them that, this is what it's fine for them, because there isn't a united, if you like, a force against them in terms of statements that would mean that we're not getting involved with you, we're not going to deal with you at all until you come back to what is right and proper, and that's looking for expanding peace, harmony, friendship for all those people in that region. And I think that's why they're not listening, because they're simply turning a deaf ear, if you like, and that's been aided and abetted, if you like, by the lack of strong united voice coming from the Arab world.
And that lack of united voice, Salim, perhaps they take that as a tacit acceptance of, among some quarters in the Arab world, of what they do.
Well, I think they don't really care what anybody else says. Dr. Ashur made it very clear that even the mother that gave birth to, which is alqaeda, they have ostracized and they've mocked and they've ridiculed and they've made plain their intentions are far more extreme and radical than even alqaeda has been, thus far. But let's look at what Islam says about this. If you look at what the treatment of minorities, Muslims, whether the Islamic history shows that the first recognition of minorities happened under Islam. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ himself had many treaties with the Jews and Christians of the Arabian Peninsula, where he offered them citizenship and protection. Likewise, we find that, for example, Amnon Cohen, who is a Zionist historian, explains that, for example, the Jews of Ottoman Jerusalem were actually free and contributed to society, and he said that they enjoyed religious and administrative autonomy within the Islamic State. How far removed is that from what we hear nowadays? It's unbelievable. So, we need to realize that, look, we got things like in Jerusalem, the person who opens up the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, arguably the most holy place in Christendom, is opened by a Muslim, and that was established by Salahuddin Ayyubi, a number of centuries ago. So this is the place that this is what mainstream Islam teaches. This is what Orthodox Islam teaches. Anything outside of this, either one way or the other, is just an aberration. And this is the thing that we need to appreciate about the Islamic State. And I think, that for whatever reason, they've got power at the moment. We don't know how it's going to be played out, but they seem to be thriving on outraging people, which makes me suspicious about what their real motives are. Who's funding them? There's actually a number of multiple reports saying that whenever Bashar al-Assad would bomb certain areas, for some reason, the ISIS, as they were known then, their headquarters would be absolutely unharmed. They'd be painted a certain color and they'll be unharmed. Are they pawns being used by the Bashar al-Assad government? I don't know. Dr. Ashur would be probably much more qualified to speak about this than me. But there's a lot of things which are very fishy about this group. And I think partly their aims is to demonize Islam and Muslims. And this will play into many people's hands, I believe.
Well, sadly, we've run out of time. But fascinating discussion. That's Salim Shagtai, Head of Public Relations at the Islamic Education and Research Academy. Also joining me in the studio, Halil Charles, Head of Media and Communications for the Muslim Association of Britain. On the line, Dr. Omar Ashur, a Senior Lecturer at the University of Exeter, also a Fellow at Brookings. Many thanks for joining me, Brendan Cole, on The Voice of Russia in London.